Hey guys, welcome back. Time travel in this series is a mess and often contradictory, but I have to admit with Tears of the Kingdom, they have come a long ways from the problems we saw in Skyward Sword. At least, it seems to be all nice and tidy considering the loop we see with Zelda, the Master Sword, and the Light Dragon. Unfortunately, there is a glaring contradiction in the logic presented, and that is what I'm going into detail about today. With that being said, kick back and relax while I walk you through it. Let's get into it. Part 1. The Missing Sword Theory. Tears of the Kingdom tells a story where the events of the past influence the present, and those events go on to influence the past in a never-ending cycle. It's kind of like what we see in Skyward Sword, except in this case, it was a lot more airtight. However, as much as they wanted this outcome in Tears of the Kingdom, they screwed it up. You see, during the starting area of the game, the Great Sky Island, you can see the Light Dragon flying around just beyond the Temple of Time. She is there while Link is running around going to shrines, but she is far enough away that you can't make out the finer details. We of course all know that there should be a Master Sword in her head, and we all know that sword would be streaming a trail of light. That trail of light is not there though, and skilled players can get close enough to her using wings to see this clearly, though they will void out if they get too far from the starting area. On my second playthrough of the game for footage, I flew out to her and got that view. Simply put, the sword is missing from her head during the tutorial, and immediately following its conclusion, the sword appears and Link is now able to land on the dragon. The theory I floated in my mystery video was the possibility that the act of sending the Master Sword back in time actually altered time and modified the present. I like to call it timeline reconstruction, though I don't think that there is any specific term out there for it. In this logic, there aren't branches of times as we have seen in the past games, but a single one that updates based on changes to the past. In that sense, changes to the past ripple forward to modify the future, even around the observer. I realized that the base premise of Tears of the Kingdom was a stable time loop, where the past was already set by the events in the future, and thus the future was set in stone. However, because the dragon is lacking the sword in the tutorial, timeline reconstruction then becomes the only way that could account for this discrepancy, at least from a lore perspective. Just to be clear, here is a breakdown of what happened. Zelda obtains the secret stone from Raru's hand, falls into a pit, and goes back in time. Stuck in the past, she takes her place in the imprisoning war. Once it is done and Raru is sealed, Zelda still has no means of returning home. The Master Sword then appears, and she decides to become a dragon to carry the sword to the future for Link. This of course means that when we see the dragon in the present, the sword should be there. We can see how her, I'm gonna call them hair curls, have wrapped around the sword to secure it in place. With the sword being missing during the tutorial, this time loop has a serious error and thus the discrepancy I mentioned. It could be as simple as the developers were trying to hide the sword during this section, not to spoil the surprise later. I really hate that type of meta reasoning, and I want to believe that the writers of this game were better than that. Still, I have to accept that it's a possibility, that something in the story wouldn't make sense for the sake of preventing the players from figuring things out too early. So I did what any good theorist would do, and came up with an alternate explanation within the lore. The idea I had was a past existed where the Master Sword simply never appeared. Zelda was stuck, her teacher had died, and things were pretty terrible, with Minoru at death's door, and planning to raise the last of the Great Sky Islands as a type of memorial to the Zonai. Zelda gave in to despair and swallowed her stone, thinking it was the only way she could reach the future again. At least then, some part of her would be around to see Link again. I call this the Zelda in Despair timeline. The Master Sword throughout the series is an implement that can alter time. As discussed in my past video about Skyward Sword's biggest mistake, we see the sword do exactly this when left in the past. We see it in Ocarina of Time, which of course led to the infamous split between the adult and child timelines. And if you ask me, there is a story about the Fallen timeline to be written that involves the sword perhaps being destroyed, and a new one being created by the sages as stated in A Link to the Past. Given the precedence of the sword altering the events of time, and just how much emphasis there is on the scene when Link sends it back. It seems to me one of these alterations could be happening in Tears of the Kingdom. Right after it is sent back in time, the dragon comes up through the clouds, roaring almost as though she is in pain. I speculate that at this moment, the Master Sword is appearing in her head as a result of reality shifting to reflect the altered past, what TV Tropes calls a delayed ripple effect. This effect is probably most famous from Back to the Future, when Marty's hand is disappearing. When Zelda received the sword in the past, this changed history as her becoming a dragon was no longer out of despair for being trapped, but out of hope to one day bring the sword to Link through her sacrifice. I think it's a pretty solid theory, and am rather proud of it despite some pushback from my peers. People were quick to point out to me that when the memory plays of her changing into a dragon, that the sword is not present in her head. I am quick to respond that the mural depicting that scene clearly depicts the sword in her head. It could be as simple as the damaged sword was buried to its hilt and then grew out of her over time as the blade rebuilt itself from light. If this were the case, then the camera angles during the memory would obscure the sword. As elegant as my theory is, there are still some lingering doubts. The game itself certainly presents itself as a closed time loop, and so it could be a simple error from the developers, right? With a new tool at my disposal, it's time to look for some evidence and get to the bottom of this. Let's get to that. But first, are you enjoying the video? If you are, a like and subscribe would help the channel out. I put a video out every week, and I respond to all of my comments. Now with the YouTube stuff out of the way, let's move on. Part 2. The Light Dragon Model. In 3D games, objects that are in the distance often have a lower quality model, since you wouldn't be able to see it clearly. This cuts down on processing, along with various other techniques designed to cut corners. And we all know that with the Switch's hardware, they needed to cut as many as they could. Supposedly the game was delayed a year for the sake of optimizing it in ways like this. As such, the dragons have low polygon models as well, and this includes the Light Dragon. Thanks to the use of a new camera mod on my third replay for footage, I was able to take the camera to the Light Dragon in the tutorial to better investigate the situation. What I found is that she is indeed using a low poly model. It's pretty terrible up close too, have a look. No scales, flat shading, the eyes look odd. But most important of all is that on her head, there are hair curls around where the sword would be, but no sword. To me, this says that there should be a sword there, but for some reason it's not showing up in the low poly model. If I were to guess, maybe so they didn't have to load an extra texture for it, or maybe the light trail. Camera tricks aside though, through the course of the normal game, you can see her without the light trail even if she has the sword. If she is far enough away from you before pulling the sword, the light trail will not appear. But once you get close enough for her high-res model to load, the trail and sword will become visible. So this brings the question too, are you able to load her higher res model during the tutorial? Yes, you can, and I have footage of it. I actually managed to do it on my second playthrough when I flew out to her. The game loaded her higher poly model where her detailed scales and all that shows, and yet the sword wasn't there. However, this footage was a bit frantic because I was fighting to get a view on a wing, and had a time limit before it expired or I hit the void out zone. Now with the free camera, I can take my time and get better footage. At the end of the tutorial, standing on top of the Temple of Time, Link is close enough to her that her high-res model loads. Taking the camera to her, this is what I found. Just like what I spotted before, she is lacking the sword. But this time I was able to confirm something else. The hair curls are there where the sword should be. So now we have a new mystery to solve. Why would the hair curls be there but not the sword? Following the cutscene where you send the sword back in time, the dragon immediately emerges from the clouds, and notably lacks a trail of light, all while the camera angles hide where the sword would be from the viewer. Then, after the cutscene, if you look up into the sky, you will see her with a trail of light. It is at this point that I again use the camera mod to fly up to her to investigate, And what I found is that in both instances of her model, low and high poly, the sword was now visible. This clearly means that the choice to remove the sword from the tutorial was intentional, and that is at the core of this mystery. There are 3 possibilities why the sword was not visible, so let's get into that. Part 3. The Invisible Sword. I've heard and seen footage of people smuggling the Master Sword out of the start of the game, and in doing so, it causes an error with the game in which the Master Sword will not be visible in the dragon. The hair will still be curled up around it, but the sword will be invisible. And so Link would go on to draw an invisible sword and look really goofy. I can't help but to wonder if something similar is happening during the tutorial. Perhaps the game is responding to the decayed Master Sword in my inventory the same way. With the tools at my disposal now, I was able to test this for myself and simply avoided picking up the decayed Master Sword from the Room of Awakening. Once I got to the dive and the dragon appeared, it was still missing the sword and the trail of light. And so I could now rule out that it wasn't some strange conflict with having the decayed Master Sword in my inventory. I did take the camera to the dragon again just to make sure, and the sword was not there. With that prospect eliminated, we are now left with a few potential options as to what is happening here. There is one other thing about her model to bring up, which is the oddity of the hair curls being there when the sword is not. You would think that if they were trying to hide the sword, in addition to removing it from her, they would have changed her model to look like the one after you had drawn the sword. The fact that the hair curls remain there wrapped around an invisible sword is strange, especially since a player could theoretically see that. I think that most people would agree that the sword should be in her head during the tutorial from a lore perspective. Since it isn't, there are 2 outcomes. Either it was removed to avoid spoiling the story, as I've stated before, or it was removed for a lore reason. If it was removed to avoid spoiling the story, then they were lazy and didn't remove the hair curls, perhaps thinking that they would blend into her fur. I have to admit, it would be hard to spot unless you knew what you were looking for. Alright, let's say that they did remove the sword during the tutorial to hide it. Why? Was it simply to avoid spoiling the surprise? It could be that, but I think there is another more interesting explanation. One that relates to the fanbase. Consider this. Breath of the Wild had a demo, and in it, players could play the whole starting area of the game, the Great Plateau. This led to plenty of speculation in the community. Crazy talk, like people saying that the plateau was the location from Ocarina of Time. With the past of Tears of the Kingdom out in the open, we know that particular situation cannot be the case. But I digress. My point being that the demo led to a lot of discussion back then, a lot of over-analysis. Tears of the Kingdom seems to neatly have the Great Sky Island set up in a similar manner. And so, I proposed the idea that this section was meant to be a similar type of demo for players. In fact, some Zelda tubers were even invited to play it before the game launched. With the hype train leading up to Tears of the Kingdom's release, with every single frame of footage from trailers being scrutinized, and every camera angle being found, I could see Nintendo choosing not to release a planned demo merely to prevent aspects of the game from being spoiled. This is especially true when we look back at their aggressive nature they had with YouTubers at the game's release. Simply mentioning or showcasing auto-build in their videos would get them in trouble. Zelda himself, who was allowed to play and record parts of the game, stated that he was under heavy restrictions of what he could talk about. And yes, I scanned through his footage of the Great Sky Island looking for the dragon, and sadly it wasn't there, even in places where it should be, which is circling behind the Temple of Time. We don't know why a demo wasn't released like with Breath of the Wild, but if they were planning to, then hiding the sword like this suddenly makes sense. Surely the community would have scrutinized every little detail. And if the sword was visible, if only a little, on the dragon's head, with a trail of light coming from it, no doubt speculation would have run wild. I think that Nintendo thought the community would figure it out, and so they solved that problem in a lazy manner. They simply removed the sword or made it invisible, all while turning off the light trail. To me, this is the most likely scenario. It sucks too. I thought the idea of a timeline alteration by the sword being sent back in time was really interesting. Part of me hopes that is actually the case and that this meta-logic reasoning isn't true. Basically, I want the lore of the game to determine what we see in it. By all accounts, we should be able to see the sword and the light trail during the tutorial. It simply doesn't make sense for it not to be there. I don't care if it would have ruined the surprise. I value consistency more. One final thing. If they were truly concerned about aspects of the story not being ruined or spoiled, then let's not forget about how terrible the memories are laid out. Nintendo's stubborn clinging to being open and letting these memories be obtained out of order already ruined the story. So again, I ask, why hide the Master Sword during the tutorial? Is it merely them trying not to spoil the surprise? Could it be that there is more to the time travel going on than it seems? Or was it that Nintendo was trying to stop the fans from figuring out what was going on before the game came out? Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. I'm really curious about your thoughts on this one. Do you think that they were just hiding the sword? Or do you think that there might be something to do with time being altered by the Master Sword getting sent back? Or perhaps you have a different idea altogether. Let me know what you think either way and I will respond. My channel is made possible by the generosity of my patron and channel members. Their direct contributions to me is what makes it possible for me to keep doing this every week. If you like my content, please consider joining up so I can keep doing the thing that I love. Doing so will gain you access to my Discord where we can talk more directly. I can get pretty chatty at night and I love bouncing my ideas off people. My community is still growing and I hope you will join it. That's all I got for you today, guys. Be safe and may the way of the hero lead to the Triforce.